I did do a fellowship, a sabbatical at Dartmouth in 2018. So spent about a year, even though I wasn't living in Hanover, I was here every day in the Department of Biology. And what a great place to be. So as soon as I got the invitation to come here and talk about my book on trees, I didn't hesitate to say yes. And it's good to see all of you here interested in trees. I believe we're zooming this as well, so I will try to stay here by the mic and look into the camera if there is a camera. And how do I get this to start?
Sorry. Technology is something, isn't it? That's all we need to do. And let's just check.
Just arrange the camera a bit like this. Just
Oh, the camera's on.
the camera is just your. I'm just gonna check the audio. Yeah, to that.
Let's see if it's start. No, it's not starting.
It's nice to have you eyes here.
We spent 45 minutes beforehand getting this all set. There we go. Oh, and could we turn the lights? Yes. In this one, do that. I take a little pride and also think that the visual part of the presentation is important, is what I'm going to say. So I want you to be able to see all the colors and all the forms and everything else. So if we can bring those way down, I'll begin. To know our trees, a vital responsibility for today and the future. Let's start with this slide. We can keep going down. I want it really dark. I don't know who this guy is, but this is how I started my career as a botanist. And I spent really starting before graduate school as an undergraduate at Harvard. I took my first trip to the tropics and have spent the last 50 years exploring really every tropical land in the world. I've visited 65 countries, done research in most of them, have many colleagues in those places. And I was very interested primarily in the plants that grew in these tropical environments where there's more species than anywhere else on the planet. But I also was very interested in the different habitats you find in the tropics, whether it's cloud forest or rainforest or deserts or middle elevation forests. But I was particularly interested in all of the animals that were there visiting the plants, and wrote many papers and a number of books on this interaction between plants and the animals that mostly pollinate them, but also disperse their seeds. Many of these that I show up here are part of the Zingiberales, which are this eight families of tropical plants only in the tropics that include gingers, bananas, birds of paradise, heliconias, and they're all pollinated by animals in some form or another, whether it's hummingbirds or bats or lemurs or insects of various types. So I spent a lot of time in the field, actually away from my family, which is probably the toughest part, but exploring these interactions between plants and the animals that pollinate them, always in the tropics. Oops. Now, how am I going
Try
to?
clicking on it just once. Let's see.
Let me just click on the,
Yeah, I think you just.
okay. Let the mouse do the work, I was just told. So how did I end up writing this book on trees, which I just published last year? After spending this time in the tropics working on herbs, admittedly big herbs, some arborescent herbs, but all herbs. Well, two reasons, and Uni mentioned some of these. The first was when I was in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, I would walk down Connecticut Avenue to the museum every day, or on Constitution Avenue, and I'd see more and more, particularly starting in the late 90s, particularly children walking down the street looking at their damn phones. And I'm sure all of you experienced that. And so I said, I've got to figure out some way to get them to not look at their phones, but look at the trees on Constitution Avenue, look at the trees on the mall, walk in the forest and look at the trees. So I developed this little iPhone app called LeafSnap. Some of you may have heard of that. It's no longer around. But I developed this with some computer scientists. So you can quickly take a picture of a tree, of a leaf of a tree, and within 10 seconds, it would tell you what that tree is, and then lead you into this whole smorgasbord of information about what you're looking at. Because I wanted it to draw people into that. So we developed LeafSnap primarily for the northeastern US, for 200 species of trees in the northeastern. And within a year, there were 1 million people using LeafSnap, many of them children, not just in the northeast US, but from around the world. I was getting identifications from South Africa. There are a few North American trees in South Africa, but people wanted this sort of technology. And now, even though LeafSnap isn't available, you do have iNaturalist and a number of other capabilities of using your iPhone to actually enter the natural world. And that was the beginning of this. We started this in 1999. But that's how I first started getting into trees. I didn't want to identify tropical herbs. Nobody would have used it. But trees along Connecticut Avenue and Constitution Avenue, people would look at. Then I also, because I started getting interested in trees and also more in tropical trees, not just temperate zone trees, I also developed this thing called DNA barcoding, and that was mentioned in the introduction. DNA barcoding is just a scientific, nerdy, egghead way of identifying a tree if you don't know how to identify it. You take a little segment of tissue, you sequence it in the laboratory, or now we have handheld sequencers that you can sequence it, and with just this little 500 base pair section of DNA, you can identify what species it is. And so we developed this for 10,000 species of trees, mostly in the tropics because that's where it's most difficult to identify the trees. But it was another way that I got into trees through this idea of a DNA barcoding. In fact, Dartmouth people in biology are DNA barcoding trees on campus and out in the forest as well. So it's a pretty popular and successful and accurate technique. Work. Anyway, all of that ended up that I wrote this book, or I started this book about 10 years ago. Smithsonian Trees of North America, published by Yale University Press. They kind of built on that earlier stuff, whether it was LeafSnap or the DNA barcoding, that just built on that. And I decided to expand that work out to the trees of North America. Now, there were a couple of copies in the back for sale. It's not a light book to carry around with you in your backpack. 800 pages long, pretty hefty. But it was an attempt not just to allow people to identify trees, but to give them information to appreciate trees more, learn something about those trees, particularly visually through photographs, but also use those trees as a road to understand more about nature, which I think is so important today, is to get us more involved and more interactive with nature, just like those bats and hummingbirds that were pollinating heliconias in the tropics. I want people to get more involved in nature. And you as a garden club clearly are involved in nature. So some of this maybe is not necessary to say, but that's kind of the background on the book. I'm going to get into the real subject, but let me just say, I started this book about 10 years ago when I still was in residence at the Smithsonian. By the way, I'd decided to become emeritus and move out of Washington during the first Trump administration. It just was too much for me to be in Washington during that. So we moved to Vermont, and I worked on this book mostly while I lived in Vermont. Unfortunately, a few things happened during that time, like the pandemic and all this stuff that slowed it down. But anyway, the book was now published. But let me give you a little background here and put trees into perspective as we see them today. And I want to start with a history of our planet, because most people actually don't understand the time scale of what we're talking about. So here's the Earth, first picture of the Earth from outside the Earth in 1972, and there it is. The Earth began 4.6 billion years ago. 4.6 billion. That's a long time ago. Life didn't begin on the planet until about 3.8 billion years. So there's a billion years that went by when the Earth was just circling around, kind of getting its act together, and suddenly about 3.8 billion years ago, life appeared. Life began in the seas, in aquatic environments, And about 500 million years ago, think of that, it started 3.8 billion, and 500 million years ago, life crawled out of the oceans onto the land. And this was the beginning of the colonization of land by life. Plants didn't evolve until about 450 million years ago. So we're getting a little bit closer to present. Trees first appeared about 300 million years ago. So trees weren't the first form of plant life on the planet by any means. It was small algae and things related to mosses. But trees appeared in the form that we recognize today as a tree about 300 million years ago. Then what happened? Humans appeared about 300,000 years ago. Life began 3.8 billion years ago. Humans evolved 300,000 years ago. Agriculture didn't start until about 10 to 12,000 years ago. So we're getting closer to present. Very important thing happened 250 years ago. We started using fossil fuels as a source of energy. 250 years ago out of 4.6 billion. So that gives you some idea of the history of the earth, when life came, when trees came, when we came, and now an important event, which is the beginning of alternative uses of fossil fuels. Remember, those fossil fuels came from those trees that evolved 300 million years ago. Okay, so we're using that fossil fuel now. And here we are. No, we're not here. This is New York City. Fortunately, we're in Hanover. We're not in New York City. Although some of you online may be in New York City, so I don't want to say anything bad about it. But how did we get here? Well, and what is happening to our planet today? The age of humans, it was mentioned, the Anthropocene, the Anthropocene, the age of humans. It's all about how we as one species evolving 300,000 years ago have had an impact on the planet. When we think about trees and we think about environment, you think about biodiversity, there are 8 things that come to my mind that I've been documenting now as part of my interest in conserving biodiversity. And they're listed here. I'll just go through them quickly, but these are things that humans are doing that have a major impact on the planet. The degradation and destruction of natural habitats, pollution of air, land, and sea, not just by CO2, but by all kinds of pollutants, whether they're chemicals or plastic, exploitation of species, using species for our own daily lives, spread of invasive species, and as gardeners, I'm sure you are all aware of the impact of invasive species on our natural habitats. Spread of diseases, many of the diseases that affect plants and animals in the wild are spreading now and have come from different places. Urbanization, and that's why I start with this photo of New York City. Within, by the year 250, I think 75% of the world's population will be in urban centers. They're having urbanization having a big impact on local environments. Climate change is the biggest one, and that's what we're all particularly concerned about. Climate change as a result of the excessive use of fossil fuels. And then finally, another thing I just recently added, the last year or two, added to the list is conflict and war. And more we're finding that places like Gaza, places like Ukraine, many of the areas in Africa, the natural environments are being sorely affected by conflict and war in these places. And that's something we have to take into consideration more and more. One quick reason why this is all happening, well, I think there are too many people on the planet, not enough resources to be used by those people, and particularly an unequal distribution of those resources among all these populations. So there are a lot of reasons and a lot of discussion about this, but that's kind of a quick summary. So what does that mean in terms of our natural environments? Well, here's a nice tropical forest. This is on the island of Dominica, where I spent a lot of time working on heliconias. But the more and more I traveled in the tropics, this is what I saw happening to the trees and the local environments. And I'm sure you all know this. Those of you that have been out of the US to various places have seen this happening time and time again with the use of these plants and animals, in this case trees, but also causing many of these plants, and we now estimate that 1 million species of plants, animals, and fungi are at risk of extinction because of the activities of humans. We estimate there are about 10 million species on the planet, so 1/10 of those are threatened with extinction today because of our activities. All right, so let's go through. This little thing is not working as well as I wanted it to.
Are you having trouble getting it to go to the next slide?
Yes, I am. There,
Yeah, maybe just clicking on this. Oh, now this is working.
quick enough. Don't share all my slides. There, whoop, no. There. Okay, so I'm going to talk, even though I've been chatting and jabbering, I'm going to divide the rest of the talk into 3 sections, one on the essence of trees, one on the diversity of trees, and one on the future of trees. So let's start with the essence of trees. And again, many of you probably know some of these things, but since I didn't know how general the audience would be, I'm going to go into some detail here. Let's begin with the value of trees and how we value trees and really life in general or plants in general. And I want to start with the aesthetic value of trees. I was talking to Kim earlier and saying, you know, even though I'm a botanist, I'm a scientist, I'm an egghead, all that sort of stuff, I've always also been interested in art and the aesthetic value of biodiversity in terms of our everyday lives. And trees couldn't be more have an aesthetic basis to them. This is a painting by Paul Jones, an Australian contemporary artist, of a magnolia. Here he is in Australia painting magnolias from North America, which I think is great. But the aesthetic value of the trees, whether it's in art, whether it's in music, whether it's in poetry, we find a lot of dedication and inspiration through trees in terms of the artistic representation that they give us. Botanic gardens and Arboretum, another expression of the aesthetic value of trees. This is the Arnold Arboretum in Boston, Harvard University. But all over the country and all over the world, we have botanic gardens because it's an aesthetic representation of nature that we can go to and kind of count on walking down this road and seeing the same trees in the spring and the fall, even in the winter. They provide that aesthetic source of inspiration for many people. Very important. In our cities, I showed New York City, but here's Tallahassee. I don't know how many of you have been to Tallahassee, but the live oaks that line the boulevards and avenues of Tallahassee make that city livable as far as I'm concerned. Just the aesthetic with the Spanish moss hanging down, planted tens, decades, hundreds of years ago, give a certain value to living in a city life. And it's very important, not just in Tallahassee, but all over the place. Even in my town, even in Dorset, Vermont, the trees along Church Street are very important in terms of the daily life of the people that walk down that. Okay, so that's just a brief. The aesthetic value of trees is very important, and I start with that because I think it's probably one of the most important values of trees. Environmental value of trees. Any forest is there and is existing, and all these interactions that I was describing earlier, mostly because of the trees that are in the forest that provide the structure. They provide the distribution and abundance of other plants and animals within that forest. They help the forest recover after disturbance. It's usually the trees that often send up the first seedlings and things and provide the habitats for other species to come in and grow. Species interactions, as I mentioned, pollinators and herbivores and dispersers are all important. And carbon storage. Trees, particularly in forests, the environmental value is to suck up carbon out of the air. And it's kind of amazing, and I'll say more about this later, but everything alive on the planet is here for one reason: because of air, because of water, and because of sunlight. Those 3 things together lead to photosynthesis in trees and other plants, which leads to all of the energy that is consumed by the rest of life on the planet, including us. So just think of that. So taking carbon out of the atmosphere and turning that carbon into sugars and such things is a very important function of trees in their forest. That carbon sequestration or carbon storage is becoming more and more important today as we as humans send more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because of the use of fossil fuels. And there's a big push now to plant forests or replant forests or plant forests in these plantations to try to suck more of that carbon dioxide out of the air and allow more oxygen to be there. Unfortunately, we now realize that even though we've been planting these plantations of trees, it's not the best way to actually sequester carbon. It's through the natural regeneration of trees in a forest, which we get the most diverse and the most high value for carbon sequestration. Just something to remember. Economic value of trees. Some people probably would rather I've started with economic value rather than aesthetic value, but I thought I'd put economic value last, and here it is. That one sailing ship during the 1800s required 6,000 trees from New England to construct. When you think about one sailing ship, 6,000 trees, you understand why and how almost 75% of the forests in New England were cut down by the mid-1850s. Wood was extremely important in terms of construction, not only in sailing ships, but in houses and everything else. Woods and trees were used for medicines, for landscape, for fuel, for human food, and for household goods. You go in even go into Walmart now, and you will see many, many wooden products in there. Many more that are plastic, but also still many wooden things that you can buy. And so the economic value of trees and the wood they produce is extremely important. And I just put a local sawmill here in New Hampshire that I photographed to give you an idea that this is going on locally, and it's not just something happening in the tropics with big forestry projects, but also locally in New Hampshire and Vermont. Back to cities. The economic value of trees in cities is great. Trees are doing the same thing besides being pretty and adding to your aesthetic sense of an environment. They're also doing the same thing that they do in a forest in a natural environment. They're helping other animals, squirrels and birds and insects and everything exist. They are reducing heat buildup in city environments. They help in flood control and water control, all kinds of things, and carbon storage as well. In fact, now, and I put a figure down at the bottom there, maybe you all can't see it, but now cities are putting a dollar value on every tree in the city, maybe here too. And now I've checked out a number of cities and towns across the US, and between $48 and $402 per tree is what trees are valued in cities now. So when you cut down a tree, the people that are taking care of those trees, the city commissioner and all this, are noting the economic value of those trees in terms of all these services. In fact, Davy Tree, maybe some of you even have this, they have a little app. You can take a photo of the tree in your front yard and it'll tell you how much it's worth.
What?
It'll give you $1. I'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so that gives you some idea of the value of trees, whether it's economic or aesthetic or environmental. A little bit about the evolution of trees. I already mentioned that trees first appeared on the earth about 300 million years ago. Plants came on and developed a vascular system. That's just the system that allows water to go up the trunk and nutrients to come down. That vascular system had to evolve before we could evolve trees. So about 300 million years ago, we started getting trees in these carboniferous swamps, as I picture, and that's what eventually turned into fossil fuels. But all of those trees up in that upper, your left-hand corner, they're not what we think of trees today at all. They were all fern relatives. They were all relatives of Equisetum, Selaginella and everything, but they grew to arborescent form. 65 million years ago, flowering plants evolved and emerged. And now the forest like we have here in this Vermont forest, in the bottom are all primarily, not all, primarily angiosperms. So they've only been around for 65 million years. So there's a constant evolution of what we see in forests as trees from 300 million years ago to 65 million years ago to today. So today, we estimate that there are about in total 400,000 species of plants on planet Earth. 400,000 species. Of those 400,000 species, 73,000 are trees. That's a lot of trees. My book only has 326 species, so I got a ways to go, but I'm working on it. I can now actually, and this astounded me when I first saw this figure, we can actually count and estimate the number of individual stems of trees on the planet. And the latest estimate is we have about 3 trillion trees on planet Earth today. That's not species, that's individuals. So if you go out in your front yard and there's 10 trees, those 10 trees add to that 3 trillion trees. That's a lot of trees. Oh. Okay, and another way to think about those 73,000 species of trees that are distributed among 3 trillion individuals is density of trees versus diversity of trees. Density is just how many white pines are in a forest, or how many white firs, or how many red firs, or how many sugar maples are in a forest. That's density. And you see really dense forests in that bottom picture. In a boreal forest, you get very few species of trees, but thousands of individual trees. So the density is great, the diversity is low. You go up here, there I've got Earth, 3 trillion individual trees, tropical forest, those 3 trillion are distributed, 1.3 trillion trees are in tropical forests, and 740 billion trees are in boreal forests, and our little temperate forests here in Vermont, New Hampshire, and the US only account for 660 billion trees. Anyway, that's how those 3 trillion trees are dispersed around the planet. We go to the tropics, exactly different, the opposite. There are more individual trees, but there are also vastly more species of trees. So you go to a tropical forest, I do a lot of work in Costa Rica, I go to a forest here and I've measured every tree in 50 hectares of forest. There's only a few individuals, but there are a lot of species of trees. And so you have a difference between diversity and density. We did a study down in the Amazon basin of South America, and we found out that we estimated and counted, believe it or not, the graduate students counted all the trees. We estimated about 16,000 species of trees in the Amazon forest. 227 of those 16,000 species account for 50% of all the trees in the Amazon. So that gives you some idea that most of the trees are rare. And that's why we're still finding new species of trees in the Amazon. You do a similar study, let's see. I did this in North America. We hadn't done the same sort of study. We're doing it in the Amazon. We're not doing it in North America. I counted the trees in North America to do this book, and there are about 1,700 species of trees in North America. And those include introduced species as well as native species. Of those 1,750 species, 36 species account for 50% of all the trees you'll see. So very few species account for the vast majority of trees in our forest. I didn't want to do a book on just 36 species of trees. So I did another study, and I went and I found out that 98% of the trees in North America are accounted for by 326 species. And that's what's in this book I wrote. The book doesn't include all the trees in North America by any means. It includes all of the trees you'll probably ever see in your lives. 98% of the stems. So, I mean, some of you will be out there and you'll find that and go, what the heck is this thing? And there's one individual in a forest somewhere. But 326 species make up 98% of the stems, and that's what most people will find out. So remember that number. All right, let's get to the bottom of things here. What is a tree? Often people want me to start with that topic, what is a tree? But I thought I would put that in the middle after I've given you something about the history of trees and the environment of trees. I asked two young ladies, a 6-year-old and 8-year-old that I knew in London, lived in London their whole lives. Could they draw me a picture or a painting of what a tree is from their concept? And this one young lady, she was 6, her name is Kat, her name's down at the bottom there. She sent me this and I thought, wow. I thought I'd get kind of a little stick figure with a tree. Everything I learned about trees is in this painting right here. There's the obvious trunks and branches and flowers and fruits and green leaves and the sun that I said, makes everything happen. There's roots, there's worms, there's birds, there's butterflies. She's living in central London. She's not out in the country where she's seeing. And I thought, wow, I don't have to even deal with what is a tree. Everybody knows what a tree is. And I'm sure all of you know what a tree. There are a lot of technical definitions. And here's one from some of you may know David Sibley. He wrote a book on the trees in North America. And he wrote a book on birds also. He knows a lot about birds. But he gave this kind of technical definition. A tree is a perennial plant with a single woody stem, at least a few inches thick at about 4 feet from the ground, branching into a well-formed crown of foliage and reaching a height of at least 12 or 15 or 20 feet. And that's a simple technical definition. You go to the USDA book on trees in North America, and it's like a page of just defining what a tree is. Come on. Oh, this is partly obscured by the Hanover Garden Club thing, but David also gives it much simpler. He said, if you can walk under it, it's a tree. If you have to walk around it, it's a shrub. Period. So you're gonna probably all remember that one. That's probably. All right, a little bit about the structure of trees. Again, this is probably familiar to many of you, but I thought I'd just give some examples. And trees have every possible form. They're round. If you look at a maple, it's a nice round tree, particularly if it's out in the open. Many conifers are conical. You can see they're evergreen and they have this conical shape. There are things like elms, which are completely random, irregular. Trees have very distinctive forms all over the board. One of my professors as an undergraduate, Barry Tomlinson, wrote a book called The Architecture of Trees, where he tried to define how you get all these different shapes, and it has a lot to do with the branching patterns and such things. But the forms of trees are very often species specific, although there's these general categories that I show here. Bark. Oh, we all love bark. Here's just a few examples of bark. You can go all the way to the smooth bark in American beech, striped maple where you have striped bark, black locust. The bark of black locust is deeply furrowed. It's just really engaging, and a lot of people plant it. They never look at the top of the tree. They just look at the bark of the tree in their front yard. Eastern hemlock and California sycamore are more flaky barks. You've probably seen that. So there's all kinds of barks, and bark is there to protect the trunk, to protect what's going on inside that tree. And what's going on inside that tree is wood. And just like there's many, 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 many types of bark, there are many, many, many types of woods. And I went to my local furniture maker in Dorset and sampled some of his woods there, and you could see all kinds of colors and forms and venation and everything. That's why it's so important aesthetically when we're making furniture and things to look at what the wood looks like. Remember that wood is there for the tree to bring water and nutrients up out of the ground, and as the leaves are photosynthesizing, to bring those nutrients back down to sustain the rest of the tree, all the way down to the roots. So there's a purpose for all that. And each of these different species have evolved that different bark to do it in their way more efficiently. Leaves, as I mentioned earlier, it's amazing to think that earth, that air, sunlight, and water, which is all being photosynthesized or going through the process of photosynthesizing leaves, that's what it's all about. And they're all green and they all do it in different ways, and they've all evolved different ways to be more efficient in the various environments where they live. Two basic types of leaves are simple leaves, like a maple leaf or an oak leaf, where it's just a petiole and a blade. And then there's compound leaves, like I showed in the bottom part of this, where you have the blades actually divided into smaller sections. So each one of those things, whether it's a palm leaf or some of the others that are multiple, it's all a single leaf, but it has a very different form in it. So you have to remember that when you're looking at leaves. Cones. Cones are a characteristic of conifers. Those are remember they appeared about, what did I say, 250,000 years ago or so. Cones are a very specific way of reproducing. I won't go into all the details, but they are very characteristic, or they're characterize all conifers and gymnosperms, and most of them are dried cones like you see in the pine cones there. Something most people don't recognize or understand is all cones are not created equal, and all pine tree or all conifers have separate female and male cones. The female cones produce the seeds like you see in this mature cone, but in the early part of the spring, you'll also see all the male cones producing all that yellow pollen that gets shaken out of a tree. Those are separate cones, and all conifers have these separate male and female cones. And in the book, each conifer has I have photographs of both those male and female, so you can begin to learn about those. Flowers. Took 65 million years, but now we have all these types of flowers today in trees. Things from maples, from magnolias, and I'm kind of partial to Magnolia grandiflora and others, where you have these big petals or tepals, small sexual organs inside, very tiny flowers, and I've pictured Lindera benzoin there with a tiny yellow flower, the spice bush. Catkins. Catkins are the flowers of things like birches. Tiny little flowers, again, separate male and female flowers, but they all are clustered in these things, and you shake them and all that pollen comes out and you start to sneeze. But those are the flowers. And then you have these things like cornus, like the dogwoods. You say, oh, look at those big, beautiful white petals. Those aren't petals at all. Those are modified leaves. And the flowers of dogwoods are those tiny little yellow buds in the center. So nothing, they don't always appear what we think they are, and you have to look closely. But there's a lot of diversity, and that's what looking at flowers is all about. And then finally, fruits. And I won't go into all the diversity of fruits, but you can have fleshy fruits like apples and peaches and things. You can have dried fruits like many of the legumes. You can have these capsules like the center sycamore, or the what is that thing in the center? Liquid ambar, which is a capsule with seeds inside of that hang, and then you have to sweep them up off the ground at the end of the summer. But in a lot of fruits, there's equal diversity of fruits as there are flowers. And for a botanist, this is heaven. Trying to understand how these things evolve, how they characterize everything is just. Okay, we're going to continue with the essence of trees and then get into diversity a little bit. And I think I have 2 more hours. Is that? No, we'll take a little bit more time. The ecology of trees, when you look at any tree, whether it's planted in your front yard or along the street or in the forest somewhere, you can really characterize that tree as one of 3 different types. One is it's native. It's a native species. Black locust is native. It evolved here in North America, whether it was in California or whether it was in Vermont. It evolved here, and it fits into the natural forest here, so it's native. Then there are those species that evolved in other places, and they've been introduced and cultivated on our street trees. Little leaf linden is one of those. We have a native linden, but we also have an introduced linden tree that came from Europe. So those have been introduced and are only here because they're maintained through cultivation. And then the third category, if you found a tree, is the last. It's introduced, it's become naturalized, and in many cases, it's become invasive. We have very few native trees that are invasive species. Some may even say black locusts, but I don't go for that. But species that have been introduced from foreign lands and like it here so much that they've learned to grow and adapt and naturally reproduce, and in many cases begin to crowd out our native species. And those are the ones that are invasive, that cause us problems as gardeners and as ecologists. So you go up to any tree, you can put it in any one of these three categories. Just remember that. I won't go into depth about the habitats where trees actually evolved, but in North America, we have a lot of different habitats, which is why we have 1,700 species of trees here. Not all, as I said, not all native. But if you go to the West Coast, you've got those great temperate rainforests in the Pacific Northwest. You go down to the Southwest, you have the chaparral, which is a dry forest. You get rain once or twice a year, that's it. You have the Rocky Mountain forest, a lot of conifers, higher elevation. You go to the Southwest, deserts and scrublands. You have a different type of suite of trees that evolved there. You come over to the Northeast, you've got the Northeastern deciduous forests, which are so characteristic with our seasonal color change of leaves. You go down to the Southeast, the same sort of diversity of habitats, the pine forest, the pine barrens of New Jersey, some of you have been through there. The coastal pine forests of the Carolinas, which are interesting because they're a forest that have evolved to be dependent upon fire. And if any of you lived in the Carolinas or been down there, you know that those forests have to burn once a year. When they burn, their cones all open up and throw the seeds out. Their bark is adapted to fire. So a very different type of habitat than other pine forests. And finally, down here in the floodplain forests, completely different, not dependent upon fire at all. In fact, they hate fire, but they all are growing in some sort of swampy or along rivers and things. All these different habitats have led to the evolution of these different types of trees. So what about the diversity of trees? Let's look at a little bit of this, primarily the diversity that we find in North America among those 326 species. In the book, there's maybe 6 or 7 groups of trees where it's a single genus, like the genus Acer, maples, or oaks, quercus, or prunus, the plums and things, that have a lot of species in North America. So I just put up this to give you some idea of the diversity of oaks. This is only half the species. There's 43 species of oaks in North America, common species. These are all native oaks. The leaves characterizing native oaks. If you go in and you look in the book, there's 6 or 7 of these plates that you can compare exactly the shape of these sorts of things. As I said earlier, there's about 1,700 species of trees in North America. 881 of those are native. And these numbers are changing all the time because more things are introduced and become invasive and all that. And 326 species make up those 1,700 species. Just wanted to repeat that. Now, good old Charles Darwin, and as an evolutionary biologist, I cannot give a seminar and not show a photo of Darwin with pretty nice beard. Darwin actually originated the concept of the tree of life. And in his book on the origin of species, some of you may have heard of, some of you may have even read The Origin of Species, his tome on how life evolved. He has one figure in that entire book of 250 pages, and it's of the tree of life. And it's this branching diagram where it shows how from one species we get many species. And as biologists, we have been trying to understand the tree of life since the time of Darwin. Even before that, to tell you the truth. This is a depiction of the plant tree of life. We have this tree of life for all organisms on the planet. This I just put up for the plant tree of life. As a botanist, I thought I'd focus on this. But here, and I put this together for a book I did on that book on the art of plant evolution. And it just shows the basic branches of the plant tree of life. And I won't go over there, but if you start at the bottom, there's things like fungi, and those aren't trees at all. But you see number 1 is gymnosperms. So the gymnosperms that have those cones are some of the most primitive forms and early forms of trees on the tree of life. Magnolias, even though they got these giant flowers, they're kind of down there on the bottom, the basal branches of the tree of life. You go up the monocots, which include the palms, and I'll show a few of those. We have some palms, native palms in North America. You can't see this word here, but they're called, there's another small group on the side in kind of orange called early diverging eudicots. Yeah, that woke everybody up, didn't it? Early divergent eudicots. Very strange name, but it's a very small group of plants. In North America, it only includes the sycamores. So you don't really have to worry about that too much, only 2 species. And then you go up, and there's these things called the asterids. And those are all the plants that are related to asters and such things, including dogwoods, ashes, and there are 44 species of trees in the asterids. And then you go over to the rosids, which are all the species associated and related to roses. What else are there? Maples, oaks, they're all in that group. And that includes the majority of trees in North America. So these branches are not all created equal by any means. Some evolved early on, some evolved late on, and they all have different numbers of species. So let's just look at a few examples of each of those. And then we'll get to the future of trees, a little bit on that. So here's gymnosperms. I just was in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. Ginkgo. Probably most of you know what a ginkgo is. It's a tree that was introduced from China. It's no longer known in the wild. It's only known in cultivation. And the streets of Washington, many are lined with ginkgos, and ginkgo fruits, and you can see the female, and you can almost see the female fruits over here, have a rather pungent fragrance to them. And when they start to fall off in Washington, everybody kind of walks to the other side of the street because they're really good. Some people eat them. But anyway, gymnosperms, most have dried cones, some have fruit cones, and that's why I put this example of ginkgo. Here's a pine. And again, if you look closely at this, there's male cones, which produce the pollen, and female cones, shown on the bottom there, that produce the seeds. All gymnosperms have male and female cones. Magnolias, or magnoliids. These include magnolia itself, the liriodendron, and a bunch of other things that are in that group. They often have these big showy flowers, fragrant, and are big trees. There are not that many of them in North America. Monocots, something, again, those trees that are those plants I was studying in the tropics, that Zingiberales, are all monocots, and they are characteristic by having special types of flowers and generally not trees, but there are some trees in the monocots, and there are a few species in North America. Those early diverging eudicots, I mentioned mostly sycamores here. This is the California sycamore. There's also an eastern coast sycamore in US. You won't see many of this group at all, but that includes those sycamores. The asterids, I mentioned, plants that are related to daisies and things. Of course, they're not trees, although there are some tree daisies. If some of you have seen those in the tropics. But many other trees that we're used to seeing are found in the asterids. And here is the one I mentioned earlier, dogwood. And then here's some people said, that's not a tree, that's a cactus. Well, yeah. It gets pretty tall though, and a lot of people will talk about their tree cacti. So I decided to include it in the book because it gets pretty big. You can walk around it and you can walk under it, but you have to be careful no matter what you do when you go to cactus. But it's a member of the asterids, and it's got these big showy flowers. And finally, the rosids, that last large group that was at the top of the plant tree of life. And this includes things like the maples, and we all recognize maples as nice little fruits on the bottom. But maples, like the conifers, all have separate male and female flowers. And probably none of you ever look at the male flowers of maples in the early spring. But they're on these little catkins that fall down there. And then the female flowers produce the fruits that are very characteristic of maples. And the same is true of oaks. you probably never knew that oaks have separate male and female flowers. And here you can see the male flowers are on these little catkins. Those are the things you sweep up off the sidewalk in your driveway at the end of the spring. And then they have the female fruits that produce the characteristic acorns. So there's a lot of stuff going on there that when you start looking carefully, and the book helps you kind of navigate some of these things. And there's those wonderful compound or lobe leaves. So that's kind of something on the diversity of trees. I hope that gives you some idea of the plant tree of life and what we have and the diversity that we have here in North America, which is really quite astounding, which is really quite, you should be proud of that. And before I get into the future of trees, I just wanted to mention something about how I put this book together, because it was not an easy task. I started this when I made that Leaf Snap app and all this, and I started taking photographs, and I said, okay, Yale wants a book on trees, I'll write a book and I'll learn a lot while I'm doing this. So I started going around to botanic gardens, arboreta, places where I would go, and I went to those places because it was easy to get a lot of species of trees as opposed to trying to find every one in its native environment. And I'd set up my camera and I'd take the photographs and whatever they had available. And then what happened? A little thing called the pandemic hit. I was only about a third of the way through the book, taking the photos. And I said, oh, now what am I going to do? I can't go to the Botanic Garden. They don't want me there. I don't want to fly up to California this one. So I said, well, wait a minute. I've got colleagues at the University of Washington, or I've got colleagues in Seattle. I've got colleagues at this Botanic Garden. Maybe they would send me parts of plants. And so I started writing to all my friends and colleagues, and damn, express mail just took off. And every day I started receiving flowers and leaves and fruits, even in some cases bark, from my friends around the world. And I set up a little photo lab in my basement in Dorset. And I spent the next 2 years taking photographs of all these things. And that's what's in that book. All those photographs I took, some of them in my basement, some of them in a botanic garden. But they're all there to show you what the parts of a tree look like, so you can begin to appreciate this. I put this slide up because there were some parts I couldn't get anybody to send me to. I couldn't get a fruit so I went back to the Smithsonian just as the pandemic was ending. These are all parts of plants that I took off and out of the herbarium at the Smithsonian. Some of you may know that herbarium, and at Smithsonian we have 5 million dried, pressed specimens that are mounted on paper, some going back 100 years old. And I said, well, I can find that little fruit that nobody would send me. And I did, and I took them back to my foot, and these are all dried specimens. So they don't have much of a collection here, but they have some things here. But these collections give us this whole range of not only way to study these things, but also a way to illustrate them and a way to show the public what nature is all about. And so this is just a smattering. All of these come off of bearing sheets, whether they're acorns or maples or pine cones or whatever. The book finally got finished and was published in September 2024. Come on, you can do it. Okay, a little bit about the future of trees, and then you can all go back out this beautiful day. I showed you when I started some photos of my experience in the tropics. When I'd go to a place and I'd collect plants there, or I'd deal with my local scientists and I'd see at the same time the forest being cut down. This is what I have in my backyard. Right up the road where I live on Nichols Hill Road in Vermont, people are harvesting the trees. Some of it properly, and of course we're not going to give up using trees for timber and logging, but some of it not. And the same stuff going on in the tropics is going on probably within 5 miles of here, and we have to be aware. The same things I listed at the beginning that are affecting nature in general are also affecting and are going to determine the future of our trees. And I think we all have to remember that, whether it's The last one says conflict and war, whether it's pollution, whether it's climate change, all of that is having a big impact on our trees, specifically on the trees. There are two things that we can try to not compensate, but understand how this is happening. Some of you may have heard of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. They have devised a scheme of how we categorize the conservation status of all species. Is there so many red maples that we have to worry about that, so it's least concern? Or are there some trees that there's so few of them left that we have to be very concerned and they become critically endangered? So in the book, you also can go through each of the species there and find out what its conservation status is, if you're interested in that sort of thing. As I mentioned, also climate change is becoming more and more a threat to our natural environments as the local environments where trees evolved over 65 million years is now changing. Many trees, you may know it or not, are now starting to migrate. And we're seeing species that are more common in the southeastern US coming up to Vermont and to New England. Some of the trees we have here are migrating north as well, and we may not have them in our same forest for long. So this climate change is changing a lot, and the US Forest Service devised a scheme similar to the IUCN in terms of conservation status, but the vulnerability of every species to climate change. And they have all these categories, whether they're red, green, or blue, but whether they're highly vulnerable, whether they're moderately vulnerable, whether they're not vulnerable at all. They grow in all kinds of habitats. So that's also in the book if you're interested about how climate change is affecting these trees. And there's also things that you can do locally. And I'm sure many of you, and I think we mentioned some things at the beginning, how there are all kinds of organizations that you can join and help in terms of conserving trees or conserving habitats. And I'm sure some of you are involved in these. There are international things. Some of you may have just heard that there was, and I went to Columbia, the International Convention on Biological Diversity, which is looking at conservation of biodiversity across the planet. There's local things. There's a New England conservation organization. There's the Vermont Conservation Design, which is specifically conserving environments, and there are local things like Friends of Mad River, and I'm sure there's local conservation organizations right here. Probably in the next room there's a conservation organization. So it's all of this that you could do if you're interested in conserving trees or learning about what's happening to trees more often. I'm going to just end by saying, but no matter how many conservation organizations help, or we have and are trying to do something, all of this is happening in the face of a federal government which is trying to dismantle everything that we put together to conserve environments and to conserve nature over the last 50 years. The Environmental Protection Act, which was started by Richard Nixon, is now under attack itself. The Endangered Species Act is endangered. Climate change is being denied. All these things now we can't kind of give up in the face of this challenge that we have. And we have to remember that if we care about these trees, there's things we need to do. So I'm going to end there. Not a cheery note, but I want you to get out and do some stuff. A lot of people to thank. I won't go into all that, but please take a look at the book if you want, see what you can learn from that book and then pass it on. So thanks for enduring my hour of chat.
Just want to thank you.
Yes.
It was beautiful. Your book is spectacular. Do you want to take any questions?
I'll take questions or comments if you, I know it's a little, no, it's not that late. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the American chestnut and the steps being taken to revive it?
Reviving a species so endangered and so threatened is a big challenge. I love chestnuts. I love the American chestnut. So I'm proud of the people that are trying to hybridize it to create a disease-free chestnut. I think it's a big battle, but it has to. I mean, that's happening to all kinds of species. We're seeing the ashes here in New England that are also suffering some of the same sort of introduced disease. We're seeing the woolly adelgid, attack our hemlocks and such things. So I want to protect everything here rather than trying to bring some back, but I'm not against trying to do that. I'm all for it. Great tree. I mean, I wish I was alive 100 years ago when the chestnuts were all thriving. Yes. Yeah.
Why are there so many more species in the tropical environment than there is here? Is it the mild weather? Because our weather here is harsh, but trees survive, and there's so many more species.
It seems like the habitats are much more diverse in the tropics. The growing season is longer.
Okay,
The generation times are maybe shorter. So you don't have, everything stopping right now for 6 months. We won't see much in terms of reproduction or vegetative growth or anything till it starts again. My feeling is that habitats are more diverse and the growing season is quite different, and that has ended up with more species in the tropics.
thank you.
Yeah,
Using, as you said, certain groups of trees, the ash, beech now are affected as well. Hemlocks, what would you suggest? It's going to be planting and not just regeneration of trees, because we're dealing with invasives as well. And invasives take over areas and prevent succession. So if we intentionally wanted to plant trees, what species would you suggest for our area?
I suggest there are about 326 species. I'm prejudiced towards some things with big flowers, and I showed the magnolias or the liriodendrons and stuff. Some of those won't grow all the way up here, but rather than thinking about one or a few species, I would like to promote a diversity of species. So just don't plant a whole line of red maples. Plant 5 different types of maples that will grow here, or plant a very different array of things if you're going to do that, and not just try to select one or. But whatever you do, you have to love that species, and that's why you want to plant it.
Can I ask a question from Zoom?
Yeah.
So Anne has a question. Why did you focus your research on the ginger and banana species, and what attracted you to them?
What does that have to do with trees, Anne? She asked why
Why did you focus your research on the ginger and banana species?
2 reasons, yeah. As I said earlier, the Zingiberales, which include the bananas and the gingers and the prayer plants and the cannas and all, they're completely tropical. I wanted to spend my time in the tropics. So I wasn't gonna pick daisies or, oaks, which there are some daisy and oaks in the tropics, but I wanted to pick a group that I could learn something about how evolution works in tropical environments. And also, I was very interested in plant-animal interactions, as I showed from the beginning. And all of these things in the Zingiberales are pollinated by really exciting animals. Some are pollinated by butterflies or moths, those boring things, or bees, but others are pollinated by hummingbirds, and I've spent a big chunk of my career studying hummingbird pollination. Some are pollinated by bats, which require time out in the Solomon Islands at night, watching bats and find out what. Some are pollinated by lemurs in Madagascar. Now, how many places could I go to study lemurs if I didn't work on these things in the tropics? And so that's why I chose. Also, many of these plants were kind of unknown scientifically. And I've described many species because they were in the tropics and they were large and all that sort of stuff. They hadn't been collected as much. So it provided a challenge for me to go to the tropics and contribute to science. So, any other questions? Let me go back here and then I'll come back.
Logging has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Is modern logging practices detrimental to the land?
Well, you really want to get me in trouble, don't you? No, I shouldn't say that. No, not all logging is. In fact, logging can be done very selectively in forests by not just clear cutting a stand. We don't want to do that. That is the worst way to treat an environment. What we want to do is selectively take things, and a lot of logging in New England is done that way. There's a whole concept called ecological forestry. And that's being developed, and I showed that one group working in New England, the wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. They are developing and helping develop this idea of ecological forestry, which allows trees to be selectively logged, but also consideration be given to the regeneration of that forest. And regeneration in a rapid way and also in kind of a logical way. So there's plenty of ways to do it. And I don't want to get down on loggers by any means. I just think there's a good way and a bad way, like everything.
As a New Englander, do you have any strong opinions about wood burning stoves and the use of them or relative to other?
Yeah, I only burn dead ash trees in my, so there's a way to burn, and not everybody could do that. It relies on a wood stove or burning logs, but there's, again, I think a good way and a bad way to do it. I'm not against that at all. It does put a lot of carbon dioxide into the air, more than solar panels. So there's some choices you have to make, but nothing's better than sitting in front of a fire. Oh, Christmas Eve, so. Again, all of this is a balance, and I think balancing it is the way to.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So Marjorie has a question. She wants to know your opinion on leaving forests alone versus professionally managed forests.
Well, I kind of just answered that. I think we need both of those. I think we should just take our hands off some forests and let them grow back. Only 3% of New England has old growth, unmanaged forests. 3%. Excuse me, that was 4%. 3%. And we're trying to get more of that unmanaged old growth forest back. That'll take a long time. But we can do both of those things. We can have managed forests, not necessarily plantations, or not plantations. We can have managed forests and then leave part of it unmanaged. And those managed forests, if they're managed correctly in this ecologically forestry, well, I think we can regenerate our forests in a way. But we have to remember that as climate changes and as our habits as humans changes, the forests that come back in 100 or 200 years are not going to be the same forests that were here 200 years ago. They're going to be unmanaged old growth forests, but they're going to be quite different, I think, than what we normally would see in an unmanaged forest. One more question or comment or yes?
So I've lived on the same dirt road for 35 years and I'm part of a conservation group. And we've watched all the giant sugar maples die. And all the oaks are huge and almost the same places along the road. And a lot of people saying that's the acid rain, which oaks apparently love acid soil and sugar maples don't survive in that. Is that true? I'm sorry.
Ask an ecologist.
Okay.
I don't know if that's true or not, but not every tree will grow unlimited, with no limits at all. Some trees will die, and some will die with changing habitats, whether it's acid rain or whatever. I'm not sure what the story is with, and I've seen the same sort of maples doing that, and oaks doing things differently. They all grow at different rates. So you might have a maple and an oak that look the same size, but they could be quite different ages. And that's what learning more about trees is all about. So, do I see one more hand over here? Thank you very much for tolerating.
So